He had won every battle the king had ever sent him to fight, and he had lost none of them. 20 years of service and 20 years of victory, and the kingdom's borders had never been more secure. When he rode back from his greatest victory, the streets were lined with cheering soldiers and grateful men. He entered the throne room and knelt before the king and presented the victory with a bowed head. The king looked down at him and said nothing, and his expression held nothing that resembled gratitude. A senior advisor leaned toward the king and whispered something that took less than a minute to say. What that whisper contained nobody in the room ever discovered, but its effect was immediate and permanent. The king stood from his throne and spoke with cold authority, and palace guards moved toward the general. The general looked up from his kneel and saw what was happening, and his eyes went completely still. He did not fight, and he did not beg, and he did not speak because he understood immediately. He was escorted through the palace and through the gates, and thrown into the dark road outside. He stood in the road and looked back at the closed palace doors for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away from the kingdom into the darkness without looking back again. The wilderness beyond the kingdom's borders was wild and untamed and completely unforgiving. He walked into it with nothing but his armor and 20 years of knowing how to survive. He found a valley deep in the wilderness and stood at its edge and looked at it for a long time. Then he set down his armor and picked up a stone and placed it on top of another stone. He worked alone through the days and slept by small fires through the nights without stopping. What he was building had no name yet, but it had a direction, and that direction never wavered. And the kingdom that had thrown him out went on without him, as if he had never existed at all. Weeks passed, and the structure in the valley grew from stones into walls and walls into something more. Then one evening, figures appeared at the edge of the wilderness. Exiled soldiers and outcasts and wanderers. They had heard something moving in the wilderness and had come to see what it was. The general looked at each of them and said nothing for a long moment, and then he nodded once. They stayed and worked beside him, and more came after them, and the valley began to change. He trained them the way he had trained soldiers for 20 years, with precision and patience and purpose. He built not with anger but with the cold, focused energy of a man who has decided something final. The settlement grew through the seasons into a fortified community that operated with military discipline. Men who had been lost and directionless found something in the general's valley they had not had before. He gave them structure and purpose, and in return they gave him something an army cannot buy. Meanwhile, in the kingdom, the trade roads that passed near the wilderness began to behave differently. Merchants found certain routes blocked and certain passages closed by quiet, disciplined men. Goods that had flowed freely began to slow, and prices in the kingdom's markets began to rise. The king received the first report and set it aside, and received the second and frowned, and the third arrived. By the fourth report, the cold composure on the king's thin face had developed its first visible crack. The senior advisor who had whispered against the general now stood before the throne with less certainty. A scout was sent into the wilderness and came back with a report that made the throne room go quiet. He described walls and training grounds and organized men and a leader whose face he recognized. The king sat very still after the scout's report, and the throne room waited for him to speak. And the name the scout had spoken sat in the air of that room like something that would not dissolve. An emergency council was called, and advisors gathered, and voices rose and fell without resolution. The king eventually made a decision, and 3 royal envoys rode out toward the wilderness under a white flag. They arrived at the settlement walls and looked up at what had been built, and their expressions changed. The general stood on the wall above them and looked down with eyes that were completely calm. He came down and stood before them and crossed his arms and waited without saying a single word. The envoys delivered the king's message, which contained an offer and an acknowledgement and a request. The general listened to every word without his expression changing by even the smallest degree. When they finished speaking, he stood in silence for a long moment that made the envoys deeply uncomfortable. Then he turned and walked back toward his settlement, and his men parted to let him through. The envoys called after him, and he did not stop and did not look back, and the gates closed. He walked to the settlement wall and stood alone, looking toward the distant lights of the kingdom. He stood there for a very long time while his men waited below and said nothing to each other. 20 years of victories. One whisper. One closed door thrown open into a dark, empty road. He had not built the settlement out of revenge, because revenge is a fire that burns the one who carries it. He had built it because a man who knows how to build things cannot stop himself from building. and what he had built had become something the kingdom could no longer afford to ignore or dismiss. At dawn, he stood before his assembled men and spoke to them with quiet, absolute authority. He said, "We did not come here to destroy anything, and we did not come here to take anything." He said, "We came here because we were left with nothing, and from nothing we built something real." And on the wall above them, a new flag rose in the morning wind that no kingdom had ever seen before.